Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar. Just to let you know that it is being recorded. My name is Katie Haycock. I'm the Learning and Development Manager for the NPA, and I'm joined by Poonam Chudasama, who's also one of our Learning and Development pharmacists in the team. And we're really pleased that colleagues from NHS England are here to talk to us about the NHSE Foundation Training Strategy and the development of training plans for Foundation trainees for the 2025-2026 year. We will aim to take a few questions in the session, depending on how we're doing for time, but we will also collate all of your questions and create a questions and answers document that can be used as a resource by members. We might add it to the supervisor training as well. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Nick to get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I'm going to share my screen so you can see our slides. Katie, can you just let me know if that's presenting clearly? Very good. Thanks very much. Okay, welcome to the webinar this afternoon. My name is Nick Haddington. I am Pharmacy Dean for NHS England in the South West. I have my colleague Katie Reigate with me today, who's also going to be presenting as part of the session today. We are going to be talking about the initial education trainee and in particular the Foundation Trainee Pharmacist Programme in 2025 onwards. The focus today is two things primarily. Number one, the NHS England assessment strategy, which all sites must use to support the assessment of their trainee pharmacist for the 25-26 training year onwards, and also the preparation and submission of training plans for Foundation training, which previously was submitted to the GPHC and is now submitted to us as NHS England. So to begin with, I'm going to start talking about the Foundation Trainee Pharmacist Programme, the FTPP, and then give you some more detailed information about the assessment strategy. And then I'm going to hand over to Katie about midway through, who's going to talk to us about training plans. So the Foundation Trainee Pharmacist Programme, the Foundation year is the new name for the pre-reg year, so it's the 5th year of training which comes after the 4-year MPharm course, or indeed after an OSPAP course for people who have graduated from OSPAP courses. There are some significant changes in the 25-26 training year which have come about because of the new learning outcomes that the GPHC published in 2021. As a result of that, we as NHS England have been accredited by the GPHC for the management and delivery of the Foundation Training Programme in England. This slide gives you 3 headline pieces of information about requirements for Foundation training for 25-26 onwards. Number one, all Foundation training sites, so everybody who has a trainee pharmacist, must use the NHS England assessment strategy. The assessment strategy has a range of different assessment activities within it which must be conducted. All training sites must use the NHS England ePortfolio, which is provided to all training sites. And this allows you to record your use of the assessment strategy and all of the activities that your trainee pharmacist is completing during that time. It's also used to record the sign-off of the learning outcomes and all of the progress reviews and final declaration that need to take place. Linked to this, every training site must complete a training plan and submit that to us, NHS England. As I've said previously, it needed to be submitted to the GPHC, and this has now changed because we are accredited by the GPHC for the management of the Foundation training year. So, to talk a bit about the assessment strategy in more detail, these documents are available on our website. Links will be provided in the slides that you can have a look at later. The left-hand document here is the assessment strategy itself, and on the right-hand side we also have a guide, which is a much larger document with loads of information within it that gives you detailed information on how to use the assessment strategy in practice. Today we're going to talk you through some of the basics and introduce the assessment strategy so you can then go away and have a look at these documents in more detail with a greater kind of initial understanding. As I said previously, in 2021, the GPHC, the General Pharmaceutical Council, released a new set of learning outcomes for the initial education and training of pharmacists. Previously, we had one set of learning outcomes for the MPharm degree and then a separate set of performance standards for the pre-reg year. We now have a single set of learning outcomes that is used throughout the entire 5 years initial training period. And there's 55 of those learning outcomes. Importantly, and many of you will know this already, those learning outcomes incorporate independent prescribing. So instead of having to do a post-registration independent prescribing course, these pharmacists will join the register as annotated independent prescribers. The GPHC for the first time have used Miller's triangle to describe the level at which a learning outcome needs to be demonstrated. And that explains why we're using the same learning outcomes in the MPharm degree and in the foundation training year, because those learning outcomes have to be demonstrated at a higher and a different level in the foundation training year compared to in the MPharm. The learning outcomes are organised into 4 different domains. Domain 1, person-centred care and collaboration. Domain 2, professional practice. Domain 3, leadership and management. And Domain 4, education and research. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a picture that shows you what Miller's triangle is. It describes 4 different levels of demonstrating a learning outcome. The most simple being knows how, and the most complex being does. And for the foundation training year, most of the learning outcomes, the majority of them, need to be demonstrated at a does level. And really that translates into a trainee pharmacist doing something repeatedly and reliably in a real life setting. That means in a pharmacy setting, seeing patients and doing the things that you would want a pharmacist or trainee pharmacist to be doing in practice. Many of you will be familiar with the interim learning outcomes, which have been used for the past few years before we get to the first year when we use the full learning outcomes. This slide and the following 2 slides shows you the interim learning outcomes that have now changed to become the full learning outcomes and how they have changed. Typically speaking, this is because the interim learning outcomes removed the focus on independent prescribing, which are being reincorporated for the full learning outcomes, and there are also some references to the COVID-19 pandemic which are being removed. I'm not going to talk through these in detail, but I will just skip over briefly. So we've got learning outcomes 19, 23 and 26 on this slide. You can see also some of these, the level of demonstration are changing. So 23 is changing from knows how to does level in the foundation training year. And you can see in learning outcome 26, that shows that independent prescribing is being incorporated into that. 27, 28 and 29 have also been modified for the full learning outcomes, as have 31 and 36. And you can look at these in more detail, but these slides are quite useful because they highlight those differences, particularly for those of you who have been using the interim learning outcomes. Also got some additional ones here which I'd forgotten about, 37, 38 and 49. Okay, so back to the assessment strategy. The purpose of the assessment strategy is to provide you with a range of activities that you need to get the trainee pharmacist to demonstrate during their foundation training year. And by demonstrating these activities, they will be demonstrating the learning outcomes, because these activities have been designed as a whole to demonstrate all of the learning outcomes during the foundation training year. So there are 28 activities within the assessment strategy, and they have been designed so that if the trainee pharmacist completes all of those, they should be able to demonstrate all of the 55 learning outcomes repeatedly and reliably in an everyday setting. So that does level of Miller's triangle, which is what is required. And it means that for those 55 learning outcomes, there should be multiple pieces of evidence triangulated against each of those. The activities are divided into 2 broad groups, and you can see the picture on the right-hand side of this slide showing this. First group are the professional development activity groups: personal development, supplying medicines, education and research, and mandatory and specific development. And we then have another broad group of activities, which are the observed clinical activity groups. As the name indicates, these are things that we need you to observe the trainee pharmacist doing in practice. So you've got some real-time observation of the demonstration of these skills. And in this observed clinical activity group, we have a specific subgroup of activities, which are the prescribing activities. And those are the ones which need to be supervised and overseen by the designated prescribing practitioner, the DPP. Bottom bullet point on this slide outline the key principles of these activities. So, number one, each of these activities has to be demonstrated to a satisfactory standard. So each of them is an activity that you need to see your trainee pharmacist demonstrating, and they have to be able to demonstrate that satisfactorily. So if they don't get it right the first time, they may need to do it another time, or indeed more than several times, in order to be able to demonstrate it to your satisfaction as a supervisor. And each learning outcome has to be triangulated against a range of evidence to make sure that we've got that repeatedly and reliably element of Miller's triangle fulfilled. This slide shows a picture, an overview of how the assessment strategy has been designed. And you won't be able to read the writing on this, but this document is available on our website, so you can have a look at this in more detail if this is something which takes your interest. Down the left-hand side, this column are the 55 learning outcomes from the GPHC. Along the top, we have the activities of the assessment strategy. And you can see these are divided into the professional development activities and the observed clinical activities and the different subgroups. Where we have one of these cells shaded in green, that shows where that activity is anticipated to routinely provide evidence against the learning outcome. Where the cell is shaded yellow, that shows that there is the opportunity for that activity to demonstrate that learning outcome if the right circumstances and elements arise during the completion of that activity. So you can see how the mapping, the heat mapping of these activities against the evidence shows that we should have multiple pieces of evidence against each of those learning outcomes. So, the assessment strategy and activities. Just to review this briefly, number one, each of those activities has to be demonstrated to a satisfactory standard that aligns with safe and effective practice. Importantly, the observed clinical activity groups have to be demonstrated multiple times each. So each of those activities needs to be demonstrated a minimum of 3 times to that satisfactory standard. Determining whether or not the performance of the trainee is satisfactory is supported through the use of supervised learning events. These are assessment tools that you can use to help structure your observation and review of the trainee's performance. And on our website and on the Learning Hub, there's more information on the supervised learning events and how to use those in practice. What we'll do next is just go through the activities in a little bit more detail, so you've got more of an insight into what is in the assessment strategy. This slide shows the first broad group, which are the professional development activities. The first subgroup is called personal development, and I would characterize these activities as being the machinery of the foundation training year. So all the nuts and bolts of what you need to do with your trainee. At the beginning of the year, you need to complete a learning agreement with the trainee and complete a learning needs analysis and personal development plan. Those then get uploaded to the ePortfolio. We also have the 13-week cycle of progress reviews. So you'll be very familiar with that cycle of review if you've had trainee pharmacists before. So week 13, 26, 39. And then a final sign-off at the end of the training year. We also have the equivalent personal development activities which need to be completed between the trainee and the DPP for the prescribing element of the training year. So this big group at the top is the machinery of the foundation training year. We then have some activities which are more about the activities of a pharmacist, so the supply of medicines, including reviewing, identifying and resolving technical and legal prescription issues, and preparing medicinal products, which is to you and me, that's dispensing, so including things like dispensing and final accuracy checking. We have activities around education and research, including teaching and mentoring, research, audit and quality improvement, and then we have a group of activities that essentially relate to specific learning outcomes and can be fulfilled by doing specific pieces of mandatory training or organizational training. And that includes things like health and safety. And we wouldn't expect people to be doing anything specific over and above the activities that you would be required to complete in your employing organization. Won't go into that in any great detail today, but please do have a look at those activities. So this was the professional development activities group. The next group are the observed clinical activities, and these are divided into two. The green ones are the activities of a pharmacist in practice, and the purple ones are specifically relating to prescribing. These activities need to have direct observation being conducted by the designated supervisor or the DPP, and use of supervised learning event tools to help assess the performance of the trainee pharmacist. Again, we're not going to talk about the supervised learning events in detail, but you may be familiar with some of these already, things like mini-KECs, DOPS, and also things like case-based discussions can also be appropriate to use in some circumstances. So you can see these activities, if you look at them, hopefully you look at those and you think, well, yeah, those are intuitively the things which we would want a pharmacist to be able to do. Things like being able to conduct a medicines reconciliation. So somebody, for example, who's come out of hospital, they may have had their medicines changed, and reconciling their medicines record, working out what stopped, what started, what's been amended. For example, medicines information, so responding to the inquiry of a healthcare professional or a member of the public to help them with information about a medicines query. And then we have the prescribing activities here, which we'll talk about in more detail in a bit. This slide, I really like, and hopefully you like it too, gives you a visual schematic of how these different groups of activities fit together during the foundation training period. You can see these are the activities which we described as the machinery, the nuts and bolts of running the training year. So we've got one dotted box up the top, which is the trainee with the designated supervisor, and another one down here, which is the prescribing learning setting with the DPP, the designated prescribing practitioner supervising. And you can see this is the cycle in the year. So at the beginning of the year, we have the learning agreements, the L&A and the PDP completed, and then the trainee does some of those activities, and they record those activities in their ePortfolio. And then we have the 13-week progress review, and the designated supervisor at this point does that formal review with the trainee and documents it in the ePortfolio. All along the way, the designated supervisor can be reviewing when they're happy that a learning outcome has had enough evidence accumulated against it to be signed off. And this 13-week cycle continues through the year, so 13-week progress review, trainee then does more activities, the 26-week review, and so on until we get to the end point, the final sign-off and declaration. Somewhere during the year, we also have the prescribing learning and assessment happening. And we don't say exactly when this needs to happen, but there needs to be a minimum of 90 hours of learning accrued during that period. It can be in one short block, or it could be long and thin, stretched out over a longer period of time. But again, we've got this initial agreement and review of what's going to happen with the DPP, and then completing those activities, and then a final review, which feeds into the end of year review and declaration. A little bit about the prescribing, the prescribing learning in practice and the prescribing assessments. Every trainee pharmacist needs to have a nominated prescribing area. Now, in England, we don't dictate a list of things that you need to choose from, but we do describe 6 principles that must guide your selection of the nominated prescribing area. Every trainee needs one of these because they need to have a narrow enough clinical context in which they can demonstrate the skills of a prescriber. It does not limit their future scope of practice as a prescriber. Within this, we're aiming for the assessment of a group of skills demonstrating the capabilities of a prescriber, and then any pharmacist that is an independent prescriber can develop into new areas of clinical practice, broadening their scope in the future using appropriate continuing professional development. But we do need a reasonably defined nominated prescribing area the trainee pharmacist can demonstrate these activities within during the foundation training period. And these are the principles. Number one, it has to be appropriate to the stage of training of a foundation trainee pharmacist. So nothing too overly complex, nothing that's a really serious acute condition, something which is appropriate to that stage of training. Number two, it has to be clinical. So it has to be clinical and relating to healthcare. So ideally, nothing like Botox for aesthetics. We don't want aesthetics prescribing areas. It really needs to be the provision of healthcare. Number three, and perhaps most importantly, it needs to be an area that the DPP is sufficiently knowledgeable and skilled to be able to supervise within. So especially during this initial period of rolling out these reforms, we need to make sure that the DPP is confident and comfortable to supervise within the nominated prescribing area. Number four, it has to be an area where there is access to groups of patients with that clinical condition. There needs to be enough throughput of those patients so that the trainee has the opportunity to be able to demonstrate those activities. Five, it needs to be agreed by the DPP and the designated supervisor. And finally, it must be recorded within the ePortfolio. This slide shows what the prescribing activities are. There are four which are kind of doing activities. The fifth activity is actually the log of 90 hours. This is a requirement of the GPHC that during foundation training, 90 hours of experience relevant to developing as a prescriber needs to be accrued and then recorded as well. These four activities here essentially set out what a prescriber needs to be able to do, and by setting out these structured activities, it allows the DPP to be able to observe whether or not the trainee can demonstrate the capabilities of a prescriber. The first two, history taking and physical and clinical examination skills, they can be completed in an area outside of the nominated prescribing area, as long as those activities do not then progress to decision making and prescribing. So if these are done as part tasks, so for example, you get your trainee and you say, right, now you're going to be doing some history taking. Here's a waiting room of patients. You can gain consent from a patient and then practice taking that history. You're not going to go any further other than gathering the history and practicing those skills, but that's something you can do repeatedly in this setting in order to practice and then demonstrate this skill set. And equally, with physical and clinical examination skills, that could be done outside of a full consultation because it's the demonstration of procedural skills. But then these two activities, the prescribing consultation and prescription writing, must be done within that nominated prescribing area. Prescribing consultation being that full consultation with a patient, and then prescription writing demonstrating that the trainee is capable of generating that prescription, or indeed demonstrating the processes of de-prescribing. This slide then shows that intersection between the two types of supervisor, the designated supervisor and the DPP. So in this final sign-off and declaration, the designated supervisor does all of these things. Number one, they confirm that all of the learning outcomes have been signed off, and it's the designated supervisor's responsibility to review evidence against the learning outcomes and sign off the learning outcomes. And that includes where the evidence has come from prescribing activities. So the DPP looks at the demonstration of those skills and those capabilities, but they don't specifically sign off the learning outcomes. That is retained as the role of the designated supervisor. The DS confirms that the required duration of training has been completed. That's the 52 weeks. They also confirm and check that the DPP is satisfied with the performance of the trainee in terms of the demonstration of the prescribing activities and the completion of the 90 hours in practice. The identity of a minimum of 2 assessors needs to be recorded in that final sign-off, which usually and normally will be the designated supervisor and the DPP. And then the final step is that the designated supervisor then makes that declaration that because the trainee has demonstrated all of the above requirements, they are therefore suitable to enter the register as a pharmacist with IP annotation. This slide gives you a bit more detail about the respective roles of the designated supervisor and the DPP, but just to reinforce and pick that out, the DPP's role is to supervise and assess the prescribing activities, but they don't have to sign off learning outcomes. They essentially need to look at the demonstration of those prescribing activities and confirm that they have been demonstrated to a satisfactory standard. The trainee then maps those activities to the learning outcomes, and the signing off of the learning outcomes is conducted by the designated supervisor. Remember, all of this is described within the assessment strategy, which is accredited by the GPHC. So by supervisors fulfilling these roles as described within the assessment strategy, they are working within that accredited process of assessing trainee pharmacists. Finally, before I hand over to Katie, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the additional elements of the foundation training program. So to begin with, what training and support do we have available for supervisors? So the main supervisors we have are the DPPs and the designated supervisors. And we would describe there being two main areas of training and support that supervisors need. The first is this first bullet point, and that is the appropriate experience and knowledge to act as education supervisors. That is a generic skill set, and there's lots of different ways that that training, that skill set can be developed and maintained. Those skills are probably fairly identical between the role of the designated supervisor and the DPP, and indeed in any kind of education role. It involves the skills of being able to, for example, support that initial learning needs analysis, to assess against a standard, to understand what good quality feedback looks like and how to provide it. The second area of training and support that is needed relates to how does the role of a supervisor function within a specific program? And that's what part of this webinar is about today, supporting supervisors to understand how does the foundation training pharmacist program work, how does the assessment strategy work, and how do they need to function as supervisors within it. Within our documentation, we also describe a person specification for supervisors, which you can look at. All supervisors need to be able to meet that person specification, so please do go and have a look at that on our website. Finally, just to outline the broad description of the support which is available in the foundation training year, which is provided to trainee pharmacists and supervisors. So number one, we as NHS England have our regional teams. There are 7 NHS England regions, and each of us has a team based in that region. We will be providing a coordinated program of support for trainee pharmacists and supervisors, but it's all about how is the assessment strategy used, how is the ePortfolio used, and how do we monitor the quality of training sites and identify when additional support is needed. This webinar today is a kind of mirroring the sort of thing which we are doing in regions. So if for those people who are watching the webinar today or watching the recording, please do link in with your regional NHS England team if you need additional support or information. Secondly, NHS England is providing access to a funded training offer that is currently being procured, and that is being made available to all trainee pharmacists regardless of their region, regardless of the sector in which they are based, and that is funded by NHS England. And last of all, we have a range of curated digital learning resources on our website, which are designed for trainee pharmacists to support them in their learning and development. Okay, that's it from me. I'm now going to hand over to Katie to take us through the final part of our presentation, which is about the training plan for the foundation training year.
Thank you, Nick. Next slide, please. So my name's Katie Rogo. It's lovely to be here this afternoon. So I'm going to be providing within this section an overview of the training plan process. This will include the requirements of the training plan. I will give an orientation to the training plan template that's available using prompting questions, which are provided in the guidance to help organisation, as well as signposting the relevant resources available to you. And I have put the link in the chat already. And this session will finish off with some further questions for organisations to consider when developing training plans. Next slide, please. So prior to this upcoming foundation year, your organisations have historically submitted training plans to the General Pharmaceutical Council as part of the training site approval process. From this year, 2025, training plans will be submitted to NHS England. And this will be done by the lead designated supervisor submitting the plan via the ePortfolio during July 2025 for the summer starters. It should be noted that the training plan does not form the basis on which a training site is approved by NHS England. That actual site approval by us is made on the basis of the agreement to national recruitment schemes, terms of participations and associated declarations. And it's within those terms of participations that all training sites agree to complete and submit a training plan in line with our requirements. The purpose of the training plan itself is to provide assurance that the sites can support the foundation trainee pharmacists through the use of their assessment strategy and the ePortfolio to enable them to demonstrate the trainees' development against the GPHC learning outcomes. Next slide, please. There are 3 parts to the training plan. Overall, the aim of the training plan is to describe how the trainee will complete the required activities within the NHS England assessment strategy across the rotations that are included in the training site programme. Details of the induction processes, including mandatory training that needs to be undertaken, and plans for developing the trainees in independent prescribing practice during the programme, including access to prescribing learning settings. The training plan must also describe the local quality management arrangements in place within organisations that will support the ongoing development of the training environment quality itself. There are some points to note, and that is there's no personal identifiable data that is requested. So we're not asking for DS personal details, for example, as part of the plan. The only exception is for the person that's actually signing off the training plan. And it should also be noted that students that have graduated against the old learning outcomes, either pre-2021 MPharms or those that have completed an OSPAP course, are not required to complete the prescribing elements of the programme, as Nick has described earlier. So the requirements, next slide, please. Each training plan must cover a single training programme as advertised within the NRS, the National Recruitment Scheme. Where one programme has multiple trainees, this could be covered in one plan, but a copy must be uploaded to the ePortfolio of each trainee. And within that plan, it must be fully completed prior to the arrival of the trainee. It must cover the whole programme, so 52 weeks for a trainee on full-time hours or equivalent for those that are working less than full-time. It must be shared and it should be agreed by supervisors prior to the trainees starting the programme. And that's really important from a setting expectation perspective. It should be shared with trainees on induction to the programme, and they must be aware of how they're expected to meet the GPHC learning outcomes and our assessment strategy within their programme. And finally, it must be signed. It's a requirement for it to be signed by a GPHC registered pharmacist or pharmacy technician. Someone with the appropriate responsibility to assure the quality of the training within that organisation. It's important to note that individual trainee timetables are expected to be created from the training plan, but we're not expecting that level of detail within the training plans that are submitted to us, although we are aware that some trainees may choose to upload their timetables onto the ePortfolio as well. So let's move on to the training plan template. Next slide, please. Part 1 of the training plan template form is presented, and this basically requests the programme and organisational information. So it's the expectation that the lead employer is responsible for the completion of the training plan. Therefore, organisations should consider before setting out or developing their training plans who within their organisation is responsible for completing the training plan. And will there be any additional governance arrangements within the employing organisations for the sign off the training plan before it's submitted? So, for example, will you require additional time to be allowed to ensure that the training plan could be submitted within the timescales? Will you have to liaise with other partner organisations, for example, and do their governance requirements require sign off by multiple individuals? Next slide, please, Nick. Part 2 of the template is the programme training and supervision plan. And this is when the majority of the detail will be documented, outlining the trainees will develop against the NHS practice-based assessment strategy and the GPHC learning outcomes throughout the rotations within the programme. The template can be amended, so you can add as many lines as required within your programme. But it's an expectation when a trainee has completed all the rotations documented, they must have had sufficient exposure to learning opportunities that enable them to complete the NHS assessment strategy and therefore demonstrated the GPHC learning outcomes to a satisfactory level, and then therefore fit to become a registered pharmacist or registered pharmacist independent prescribers for those on the full learning outcomes. So they've got some things to be considering when you're developing your plan. So in regards to the training plan overview and within those that table, are all rotations included in the training plan? And that includes both internal and external rotations. So those where you're working with other sites, and that's going to be really important for you for those of you that have multi-rotational sites programs where you're working with multiple partners. And are rotations shorter than 13 weeks in duration included in that, to make sure that you've got all those learning opportunities documented? Who do you need to speak to in organisations providing those external rotations to help you develop the training plan? Because if you are requesting external rotations, you need to have a complete picture of how that trainee is developing within the training plan. And who's responsible for supervising those trainees and rotations in agreement with the plan? So, for example, where you have the designated supervisor who's overarching responsible, it'd be really important to know if they are going on a different rotation, what are those supervisory arrangements with those alternative organisations? And in regards to inductions, we know through training that inductions are a really important time period for trainees, and we just need to ensure that they are robust. So therefore, some questions that organisations need to consider are: does the induction include corporate induction and relevant mandatory training requirements? How and when are the trainees introduced and made aware of roles such as designated supervisors, designated prescribing practitioners, and maybe practice supervisors, and those that will be supervising them in practice within your organisations? And what we mean by practice supervisors is anyone that will basically be training in different elements. So that might even be some of your medicines counter assistants or some of your pharmacy technicians. It doesn't necessarily have to be a pharmacist. It's someone who's orientates them to a specific practice. And you might want to think about how and when they're orientated to the foundation pharmacist programme plan, and does that include in setting the expectations of how the programme will work within your organisations? And how and when do trainees get access to the systems to enable them to work effectively within the organisation? So there's lots to think about within the training plan template. So we would really encourage you to start that earlier. And all of these prompting questions I'm going through right now are actually available in our FTPP training plan guidance as well. So although I've got a lot of questions here, they are documented. So please go away and have a look at guidance at a later time. Next part, please. Next slide, please, Nick. And as Nick was talking about earlier, with independent prescribing development, it's really important that there is a plan within the programme for those on the full learning outcomes of how they're going to complete at least 90 hours of supervised practice directly related to that independent prescribing. And they should describe that. So if you are having a DPP or prescribing rotation that's external, you really want to have a conversation with that DPP of how that's going to work. I did put a link into the chat earlier about a prescribing assessment and supervision document we have on our website that's really useful to start those conversations with any prospective DPPs to help start and develop this. But specific requirements that need to be considered is obviously access to that learning setting, making sure that DPP meets the person requirements that's Nick set out earlier, those satisfactory completion of the prescribing activities and those 90 hours and how that's going to actually work. So questions to consider when you're thinking about developing this part of the training plan will be how and when will the DPP meet with the trainees to undertake the prescribing? Has consideration been given to developing across the whole programme, or is it just within one part of one rotation? And is there any opportunities within the wider programme for them to develop those prescribing skills throughout the year? And then what opportunities are the trainees to undertake prescribing activities throughout the year, which is what I've just said, and what range and type of activities and the trainee be able to undertake? And are there suitably trained supervisors within the planned rotations to help develop those prescribing skills? Next slide, please. And then 2.4, the fourth part of the training plan for part 2 is about designated supervisors and those DPPs. We will be requesting as part of their application to us as NHS England, which will be a survey which we'll be sending out about May, June time, that they must declare that they meet the supervisor requirements that are set out in our documentation. And that those DSs and DPPs supporting the programme that are covered by the training plan. And they must declare as part of that application they've seen the training plan and they are happy to upload it. But within the actual template of our training plan, what we're really wanting to understand is how is there effective communication between all supervisors involved in the training of foundation trainee pharmacists? Because for most trainee pharmacists, they will have a designated supervisor and a DPP, and they might not be the same person. So in those cases, we want to understand what mechanisms and processes are in place to foster that effective communication between the supervisors. And how does the designated supervisor receive feedback on the performance of their trainees from other supervisors? And what plans or expectations of how the DPP will inform the DS of the trainee's performance and vice versa? There will be some functionality within the ePortfolio that will allow that, but it's important that there are considerations of that effective communication within the training plan before the training starts. And then moving on, there's also the training and support of supervisors and what existing support is in place for supervisors within the organisations. What mechanisms are in place to ensure that supervisors are kept up to date, of which coming to one of these webinars would probably count. Next slide, please. And the third and final part of the training plan template is about local quality management arrangements. All local organisations are responsible for the quality management of the training programme, which includes the day-to-day delivery of the foundation training programme and ensuring there is adequate supervision, mentoring, assessment and feedback relating to that trainee's performance. So therefore, we require within the training plan, organisations include information on how they provide or are working towards processes to support that ongoing review and development of training programme quality through either iterative programme review and development and also through training monitoring support and feedback mechanisms. So some further questions for organisations to consider includes what are the mechanisms for gathering feedback on effectiveness from programmes, whether that be trainee feedback, feedback from supervisors, and who's involved in the development of the programme design? Is a trainee or patient voice included in those programme developments? And how frequently is the programme or elements of it reviewed? And how do supervisors, past, present and future, feed into development and feedback of programmes? And when it comes to trainee monitoring support and feedback, and how is it that trainees provide feedback on elements of the programme, including design, delivery of the programme and the effectiveness of supervision and educational support? And all of that would help with the iterative development of quality programmes for foundation trainee pharmacists. Next slide, please. And that pretty much concludes the overview of the training plan template. But moving forward from this presentation, you may want to consider reflect on the session, how can you start developing your training plans, and do you need to consider partnerships? Are there key individuals you may want to engage with to ensure that you get the training plan prepared? And what problems do you see and how can you mitigate them? Have you got any gaps in your current programs in relation to the assessment strategy, and whether you need to consider with colleagues how you can fill them, and how can you utilise current governance, develop and evolve training plans as well? And that concludes my part of the training plan. Nick?
Thank you very much, Katie. So that's the end of our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand back over to other Katie H,
Great.
to guide us through the last part of this session.
Lovely. Thanks both for that informative presentation. Lots of great information, and thank you for the link. And obviously we will share this to all the attendees here as well. I haven't seen any questions pop up on the chat. If anyone has got any, do pop them in. But I just thought, just for a couple of questions in terms of the training plan. So obviously you've got to write your training plan and say how it fits the assessment strategy. So if you're looking at the information that you're putting in there, are supervisors okay to use like all the abbreviations in terms of the types of observations? And would they just map it across like the activities, the 1 to 28, or should they also be thinking about mapping it to the learning outcomes as well?
So in that lovely document that Nick showed that was very small font, we've done a bit of that work already for you. So our assessment strategy has already been mapped to learning outcomes already. So we would probably advise people not necessarily to go away and do that themselves, but utilise some of the work that we've already done for them in that mapping. So that would be our suggestion, but it's much easier for you for individuals to map against the assessment strategy rather than going to get, because there's a lot less of them than there are of the 55 learning outcomes. So we would suggest the assessment strategy in the first instance. And if anyone feels there are any gaps, please go and have a look at that Excel, which you can zoom in on your personal computers.
Great. Lovely, thank you. We've had a question from Priya, but if a student is completing a rotation between sectors, who will determine who is the designated supervisor?
So let me just read that question, because I think that when you're developing your training plans, it's as part of that supervisory kind of plan, it's really important to understand before that trainee goes into another rotation. And that's why we're asking for these training plans to be completed before the trainee starts, is that people really understand what that supervisory arrangement will be for another rotation. Now, if it's a significant rotation, people might want to consider having joint DSs, which obviously you would have to consider if you are having joint designated supervisor, who's going to be responsible for that final sign off and who's responsible for that communication. So, or whether if they go into a rotation, whether it's going to be more of a practice supervisor relationships where they feed back to the designated supervisor and feedback. So there's something to go away and just consider what the best model will be dependent on the rotation and the duration of the rotation, and then have that outlined and those expectations set within that training plan. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Nick.
I think that's a good summary. Just to remind people, if you are the organisation that put the training programme onto the National Recruitment Scheme, then you are responsible for making sure that there is appropriate supervision in place within the rotations. That's not to say you're providing the supervision, but you're responsible for ensuring that that supervision is in place. So if you have, for example, a 13-week rotation into another sector of practice, it isn't enough for you to say, well, that's great, they're off somewhere else and it's not my responsibility anymore, because you have put the programme into the National Recruitment Scheme and agreed to the terms of participation. You have a responsibility for making sure that there is appropriate supervision in place. So that's going to be a question of having the conversation with the rotation site to say, well, can we, who's going to be the supervisor here? Will there be an additional designated supervisor? Because you can have additional designated supervisors. Is it going to be the DPP if it's a rotation for the purpose of getting access to a prescribing environment? The lead site, the site that puts the training programme into the National Recruitment Scheme, is responsible for making sure that the supervision is in place and recording it in the training plan, which they will then upload to the portfolio as Katie has described.
Thank you. And there's another question about the NPA. So we used to have a training plan, which is like an Excel spreadsheet of our programme and how it kind of mapped across. But obviously with these training plans, they're quite specific to someone's environment. So we will be running some workshops in terms of ideas for training plans and the sorts of things that people might put in, what they might look like. We'll be running those in the future, but we won't have like a template training plan because they are going to be quite individual to each training site. So that was a question from Ahmed there. Great, and I don't think I can see any other questions on the chat. If anyone does think of anything, or if they've got any other concerns or queries, then obviously you can email cdt@npa.co.uk, and one of the foundation training team can kind of get back to you. And if you're interested in any training plan workshops, or if you've got any other questions for NHS England, as Nick mentioned, the regional team also there for support as well, and their contacts are on their web pages, aren't they, Nick, as well, if anyone needs it. So thank you to everyone for coming along. Hope you found it informative and useful, and we will be sharing it with you at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.